in the colonial period and modern period into the idea that you have two different codes of living. One of them is Sharia, and the other one is Adat. And the Adat meant customary practices, a good Arabic word, Ada. And you had in Malaysia the establishment of committees on Sharia and Adat in the different states, in the different Malay states. And years ago, I had an opportunity to talk to a member of such a committee on Sharia and Adat, and he was telling me how they come up with fatwas and make their determinations on issues that arise in their communities. And I said, well, what about the Adat part of your mission? He said, well, our job is to eliminate Adat. And this, of course, is the modern push in the 19th and 20th centuries to bring peripheral Muslim communities into some sort of conformity with a Sharia-based Islam, very often inspired by missionaries and money from Saudi Arabia or the Gulf. But the fact of the matter is that the Adat is still there. John Bowman's work on Aceh, Muslims Through Discourse, is a very fine study of levels of Islamic practice in northern Sumatra, the Gayo highlands of Sumatra, where he finds that there are several levels of Islam, and that at the top level, you have people who are madrasa trained and follow Sharia orientation and what they preach to their communities. And at the bottom level, you have folk beliefs. The one that intrigued me most when I was reading his book was the belief that the rice plant came into being when the daughter of Muhammad was cut into pieces and planted in the ground, and the rice plant sprang from her, and therefore you have the rice is a spiritual plant, but has been implanted literally into Islam by turning the origin of rice into a religious figure, and therefore you can pray for, as Muslims, for the prospering of your rice crop, and you can expect that prayer to be answered. Now, this is a shamanistic, animist sort of belief. It's fairly clear that when Islam comes into the Philippines, it comes in from the West, from what is now Indonesia and Brunei, northern Borneo, and that the same notions of Islam at a practical level of integrating the shamanistic activities and the shamanistic concepts into Islam were pretty much brought in from the West. The Islam at that time, when the Spaniards arrived, of course, one of the high points of Filipino history is that they killed Magellan, and that it was the first Westerner to get there, and they had the wisdom to dispatch him. But when the Spaniards arrived, Islam was sprinkled about the Philippine Islands in seaport cities, so that Manila is established, as Muslim ruler, and the Spaniards basically go to war with Islam. But the going to war with Islam is not the same as the conversion of the population, which is what when you talk about. how did this conversion come about, and why were the Christians so successful vis-a-vis the Muslims? And here I'm using successful sort of in quotation marks, because it's not clear exactly what Christianization meant. In a very broad perspective, if you look at the history of Islam, you have the first 3 to 4 centuries in which you have the notion of a centralized state, and the state is a Muslim state, and either symbolically or in reality, and that state plays some sort of role in conversion. Exactly what the role is highly debatable. Then you have a later period, say after 1300, when you have a second great wave of conversion to Islam in regions that I generally refer to as the Muslim South. Parts of India, say Bengal, Southeast Asia, East and West Africa, and you can put in some of the northern areas, such as China, becoming more Muslim. Now, in this later period, there is no centralized Islamic state. There is no caliphate. And yet Islam is extremely successful. So raise the question of, is the success of Islam in drawing new populations into the Ummah, is that success related to some sort of political structure, either local or conceptually universal, or is the political structure more or less irrelevant, that Islam spreads in other ways? Well, in Christianity, in a sense, it's the opposite. The early success of Christianity did not have a state behind it. Indeed, it had a state Roman Empire that was hostile to Christianity. And then in the later period, after 1300, 1400, Christianity moves very successfully into other parts of the world, and the state is behind it, so that you have Europeans who, whenever they move into a new area and try and take control, do so both for the flag and for the faith. And it raises the question of, does Christianity succeed vis-a-vis Islam because it's supported by the state in this later period? Is the state a relevant category? And if not, how does the religion make its way? So you read about the Philippines and you find that Jesuit priests played a major role in spreading Christianity, though it's not very clear how that happened, particularly keeping in mind that at the structural level, the Christian church in the Philippines was not Filipino. It was primarily Spaniards or people coming in from Spanish Mexico who were in the hierarchy. You did not have any Filipino senior clergy until the 20th century, I don't believe. And so you wonder what language they were communicating with the faithful in. Sort of like the old question of Saint this or that converting the Flemings by going to Flanders and preaching. You wonder, well, how many people could actually hear that preaching? How, is this simply a hagiographic myth that attributes the growth of a religious community to the presence of a religious hierarchy or a mission? It's very clear that many mission activities are abject failures. Christian missions, Protestant Christian missions, about which we write about so much these days, were generally failures. Where you have competition between Protestants and Catholics, the Catholics are often more successful. You take, for example, Sudan, where the Protestant missionaries there for 2 or 3 generations were able to convert virtually no one. But the Catholic missionary efforts were very successful in Sudan. So you had a large, comparatively speaking, a sizable Catholic community growing. I've been very puzzled by all of this. Why does a religion grow, particularly at the lowest social levels? People who are not cosmopolitan polyglots who can deal in the languages of the interloping missionaries, people who are not educated, people for whom religious activity is something ingrained from childhood practices more than from anything that they have learned in the way of a catechism. When I did my work on Iran, there was an underlying notion that I had that religion spreads when individual people decide to change their identity. In the same way that a disease spreads when somebody gets infected, though many years ago somebody said never compare spread of a religion to a disease because it sounds a little pejorative, but in fact the quantitative study that I used, which had come out of epidemiology and the notion of how a disease spreads, you either get it or you don't get it on an individual basis. I felt that it's very important to think in terms of influencers, as you might call them today, of people who were able to influence less educated or subordinate people in their community into changing their religious identity, so that the chief of a tribe, let us say, or the local head of a non-Muslim religious community, if they adopted Islam, then one would infer that their followers did as well, although that inference was often difficult to document in any way. The idea that you had a sort of a binary situation, you're either Muslim or not Muslim, Christian or not Christian, also struck me as being necessary for the work I was doing, but also probably false, insofar as you had people who didn't really have a clear notion of which they were. When I was living in Nishapur back in 1966, my wife and I rented a room from a high school English teacher in Nishapur, and he wanted to practice his English, of course, so my Persian did not improve much with him. But every lunch and evening we would eat with him, not with his entire family. The rest of the family ate in a different room, but we would eat in his living room, and which was kept only for sort of ceremonial purposes. There was something like a mantelpiece in it, and on the mantelpiece he had a little picture of Virgin Mary and the Christ child, and he had a Quran. So more or less to make conversation, I said, well, Mr. Fazel, I see you have this Virgin and child and a Quran, so are you a Muslim or a Christian? And he said, if the missionaries would allow me to go to the English language church services in Mashhad, I would be a Christian. But since they say that I have to go to the Persian language services, so I'm a Muslim, because for him, learning English was far more important than his religious identity. And I thought, well, gee, that's sort of hypocritical, isn't it? But then I thought, well, maybe that's pretty realistic. Maybe we should look at conversion in terms of the opportunities that a change of religious identity opens up, even if there's no intellectual or spiritual substance to the identity that somebody adopts. These ideas have been sort of circulating in my mind for a long time. And then I got into writing the book that Olga mentioned on camels, on cotton climate and camels in early Islamic Iran. And using a lot of very sort of arcane methods of extracting historical events from bits and pieces of quantifiable evidence. I made an argument there that Iran underwent a massive economic change during the period when the bulk of the population of Iran converted to Islam. And this economic change had to do with the establishment of cotton farming and cotton textile manufacture, and the growth for the first time in its history of a major export product from the Iranian plateau area. And because this export product consisted of both raw cotton and cotton thread, but also tailored garments, finished cotton cloth, because you had a manufacturing component, not just an agricultural component, that cities grew. And so you had cities like Ray and Nishapur seem to have grown from maybe the core city and the surrounding villages having 10,000 people at the time of the Arab conquests to the city having as many as 200,000 people 200 years later. Well, that's an enormously important world historical event, the urbanization of the Iranian plateau, which permanently changes the whole nature of what we think of as Iran. And that transformation is due economically to cotton, because cotton is such an important export product, and yet it can only be grown in lands with very long, hot growing seasons. And so the crucial thing in Iran was the provision of water, and this had to do with villages that were established by Muslims and by both Arabs and Iranian converts to Islam, making use of the Islamic legal principle that if you brought dead land under production, you became the owner of the land, because the Arab governments prohibited the Arab tribes from settling and commandeering the land owned by local cultivators in the areas that they conquered. But there was plenty of desert, and if you could bring water to the desert and grow a crop, you owned the land that you brought under cultivation. And that was very, very appealing, and the Arabs had the money to invest, and so you had hundreds and hundreds of villages established in the desert using water brought by underground canals. The water is brought in, water is used for growing cotton. Then the question is, how did people populate these villages? After all, you take a spot in the desert and you dig a canal that allows an artificial stream to flow into this spot in the desert. But there's no one living there because it's a desert. And so how do you get farmers to come and grow the cotton? It appears that the investors in the land who paid for the canal to be dug underground and who owned the land that was then irrigable by the water coming through the canal, it appears that they established a practice of sharing the benefit of the crop. So you could become sort of like a co-op. If you farmed in that village, you would get a share of the crop, as opposed to the traditional villages where you either owned land or you were a landless peasant. So there are a lot of landless peasants, and I think you probably had sort of development situations where people were drawn in with the promise that they would share in the benefit of the new village. And these villages were extremely prosperous, growing cotton. As I was studying this process, it occurred to me that it's probably likely that when a Muslim or a Zoroastrian, whichever one, established a new village and recruited labor in the village to come and grow cotton using the irrigated land, they probably required that the person be a Muslim or a Zoroastrian, depending on which landowner was. And that this was a way in which you had nominal Muslims created. That if you were going to go and be a farmer in this particular village, you would share in the crop, which was to your benefit, and you would be a Muslim, whether there was a mosque or not. You would be a Muslim because the crop owner, the village owner, was a Muslim. I got this idea largely from Dick Eaton and his book on Islam and the Bengal frontier, because this appears to be the way in which West Bengal became, or East Bengal became, a overwhelmingly Muslim land. That it was through land development and land holders would hire contractors to build villages, and then depending on whether the contractor was a Muslim or a Hindu, the people who would settle in that village and become farmers, having previously lived in a less organized economic state in the area. These people would adopt the religion of the contractor, so the villages were either Hindu or Muslim. The idea of a heterogeneous village where you had some Muslims and some Christians really doesn't appear to be very realistic. At the village level, you tended to have homogeneity, as far as I can tell. So Dick Eaton, I think, proved that quite well for Bengal, and I think that works for Iran, and that my original hypothesis of individual isolated people making decisions on how to portray themselves in a public context and say I'm a Muslim or I'm a non-Muslim probably was a poor way of conceptualizing the growth of Islam. My feeling now is that the cotton boom caused Iran to be the first and most important non-Arab population to become predominantly Muslim. And this growth had almost nothing to do with the government, beyond the question of property rights being guaranteed under the Sharia for people to bring dead land under cultivation. It had to do with the technology being there, with the market being there. So the cities grew as cloth manufacturing centers. But it's connected to Islam not through the government, but rather through the ulama. Because the ulama, I mean, it's very clear. I've studied this. Maxim Romanoff has done it more recently. It's very clear that in the early Islamic centuries, the largest producers of ulama were the lands of Iraq and Iran, vastly more important than Egypt or Syria or North Africa, or anywhere else. Just a huge preponderance. It certainly is no coincidence that the compilers of the 6 main collections of hadith are all people based in Iran. And I think that, in fact, if you could reorganize the books of hadith in terms of where was that hadith collected, you would find that that the collectors of hadith were way more important in terms of Iranian identity than any other identity. Iraq gets tied to Iran because Iraq is unable to grow cotton, and therefore it imports its cotton from Iran. So now you have a land that previously had minimal export product viability except for transit trade going across the Silk Road. And now it becomes a major producer of a highly valuable product, which it exports. And the people who are doing the exporting are the ones who own the land. And those are early Muslims who become ulama, often by intermarriage with landowners who previously were non-Muslims. Now, if land development and agricultural production becomes a basis for the growth of Islam in East Bengal and in medieval Iran, does that work the same, say, with peanut farming in Senegal, where you have a major involvement of Sufi brotherhood, the Muridiyya, and the growing of peanuts? There's recently been an MA thesis done in France on cotton growing among Hausa people in West Africa, and showing there's a linkage between Islam and the agricultural change there. So with then I would also throw in here in India the role of Sufi shrines as centers of production, where the shrine receives al-Qaf. The al-Qaf consists of land that can be put under cultivation and produce a product and enhance the wealth of the shrine. My guess is that the big Sufi shrines that developed in India and perhaps elsewhere, that the cultivators had to be Muslims, and that therefore you had a strong correlation between Islamization and the presence of shrines that had extensive agricultural lands. So then I looked back at the Philippines, and how did that work there? Well, the Philippines, the great product in the Philippines, in export terms, comes to be sugar, but sugar is rather late in its appearance in the Philippines as an export product. 18th century becomes important. And you don't get sugar grown on the island of Mindanao, where the Muslims remain. So then I was wondering, well, is there a correlation between the growth of export agriculture and the spread of Christianity, and that the areas where Christianity spreads most effectively are areas where the agricultural regime is changed by the presence of the Spaniards? And that appears to have some viability, because the Spanish administration had this concept of encomienda, where you could have forced labor by local people, and the people who held a comienda, a land grant from the Spanish colonial government, and these were Spaniards, they could compel the labor of the people on their land. my guess is that they also compelled their baptism, because all of the histories of Christianity in the Philippines report that in those areas where you had resistance to the encomienda system, the Filipinos would leave the land and go into the mountains, where in some parts of the Philippines, the old animistic religion still survived. So you had, my guess is that the flight of people into the mountains, when the Spaniards were imposing a new labor regime, and I think a new religious regime, I think that flight had something to do with fleeing the requirement of being Christian. So that when you got to Mindanao, the area where Islam survives, and particularly among the Maranao people, who are the largest element of this survival, they are located in the western part of the southern island. But this is a part that never acquiesced in Spanish government, because the Spaniards were continually at war with the Moros, as they called the Muslims of the Philippines. And that therefore was an area that never became engrossed into the encomienda system of the Spaniards, and did not have a major change in its economic circumstances, and had a retention of the shamanistic beliefs of the pre-contact period. But it also was Muslim. And so Islam becomes integrated into, it's less a matter of the Christian circumstance, where you had a hierarchy who were Spaniards and a peasantry who were shamanist, but rather you had a much stronger integration between the shamanistic practices and the Muslim context in the Maranao community in Western Mindanao, so that the legends they had, the myths they had, become Islamized. You have Allah doing things. Read about in the article that I wrote, some of the ways in which legends and divining practices that go back to the pre-Islamic period remain vigorously in play in the Maranao community. The text I was working on, I have to emphasize, even though I don't know exactly how that text ever showed up in Boston, but it was a diviner's manual that was heavily thumbed. It had been used, it was practically falling apart, but it had the most amazing diagrams and images in it that did not resemble anything that I've seen elsewhere in the Islamic world, but clearly were Muslim, because you had, in the bundle of texts I was dealing with, you had 5 texts that were in Arabic and Malay, and 1 text that was in Maranao. So there's the Islamic character of this bundle is beyond question. And I concluded that this probably was not only the property of a shaman, but very possibly his entire library. And that being a diviner was his primary activity, but being a Muslim was unquestionably his formal identity. So I think you had in the southern Philippines a survival of a not only of a pre-Spanish, but a pre-agricultural development state of the Philippines. The Philippines are about as far away, as I started out saying, from the centers of Islam and Christianity as they could be. But when you ask, what is the identity of the Philippines religiously? Everyone agrees. This is a heavily Christian country, that over 90% of the population is Christian, and it once had a substantial Muslim population. 8% of the population surviving is Muslim. But is that really the religious identity, or is this a purely nominal phenomenon? And is there, when one's talking about the spread of religion, the spread of religious identity, what do we do with identities that are nominal and that are interwoven with clearly non-Muslim or non-Christian predecessor cultures? Do we say, well, these are people who need to be brought into conformity with Sharia in some way, as many Muslim luminaries would argue? Or is Islam properly understood not simply as a body of dogma and ritual that come to be adopted by different people in different parts of the world, but is it also, just as legitimately, a hybrid, sort of respectable label for hybrid cultures that have not really experienced conversion in the sense that William James would think about it, or Arthur Darby Knock, or people who thought about what conversion is. And it's made me come to question, what is conversion? And how do we relate the word conversion, with all of its connotations, to the undeniable historical fact of a change in the labeling of religious identities? And how are those labels established, and do they have a meaning beyond the most superficial issue of distinguishing believers in X from believers in Y? So I think I'll stop there, hopefully having totally eviscerated anyone's notion of what the study of conversion is about, because certainly at this stage of my life, I have no idea how to think about conversion. I've thought about it in so many ways for so many years, and I've never quite gotten there. So I think I'll stop at this point. Thank you very much. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Professor Bulliet. Very interesting talk. And I think also regarding conversion, it goes together with what Devin DeVries writes about the conversion in Central Asia, and also to the large questions of, I think, anthropologists of Islam try to answer in the recent decades, or the simple question, what is Islam? I think this is the relations between great tradition and little traditions and such topics. So anybody has questions? Jackie, please.
Professor Bulliet, thank you very much for a really fascinating talk. I wonder, if we can, I think, move even further away from the fields of your study, and perhaps you can help me out in my own attempt to guide a student who is writing her thesis on conversion to the Baha'i religion in Ireland. And we're toying with her, one of her memorable quotes is of those who become Baha'i, they resist, they push back against the word conversion, also for theological reasons. They say progressive revelation. So therefore, we didn't need to change. We didn't need to convert. But the quote she brings is people saying, well, I don't celebrate Christmas, and I don't go to church, and I don't drink, but I'm still Irish. And I'm wondering what kinds of perhaps economic questions about conversion you might, I know it's not at all your area of study, but you might pose in are looking at conversion as a social or socioeconomic rather than a personal, or if you like, epidemiological phenomenon.
Well, I had a student quite a number of years ago who was Mormon, and she had done her missionary fieldwork in, if I recall, Uruguay. And she said that there had been a survey done that she had read, in which converts to Mormonism were polled as to why they had become Mormons. And they divided roughly into two categories. Those people who read the Mormon scriptures and the myths of the origin of Mormonism, and who they adopted the theology, and another group who were drawn by the family life, that they saw the Mormon families being, lots of children, being happy, being a very solid upbringing, and so forth. And she said that the study found that the correlation in terms of were they still Mormons 10 years later was very, very low for those who were ideologically convinced, and very high for those who were drawn into the Mormon pattern of social life. And around the same time, I was having some conversations with African American Muslims, and somebody stated, I don't know whether it was true or not, that in the Nation of Islam, the number of women far outweighs the number of men, because the women are attracted to the family discipline that they see within Nation of Islam families. And if they were, say, a single mother bringing up teenage boys, they liked that sort of image. And so this was not, these are cases where it's not economic so much as a social form that is attractive to the person who's converting. Now, with respect to the Baha'is, I think you do have in Iranian history, clearly there's a strong correlation between Baha'i identity and economic success, and with international linkages. Whether that obtains for other countries, I don't know, but certainly I'm strongly inclined to think that that belief is not the best correlation for the declarative religious identity of a person, but either economic or social patterning or other correlates are more important. I know I sometimes have You may or may not know, some of you, I recently wrote a memoir called Methodists and Muslims, My Life as an Orientalist. And in that, I dealt with this question that I faced throughout my career of, if you know so damn much about Islam, why aren't you a Muslim? And I've faced, I remember a woman student telling me, well, you may not be a Muslim, but I bet you've already stopped eating pork. Because obviously you're on the way, and so on. But I thought, well, if I'm being honest with myself, what appeals to me most in Islam is the notion of sunnah, of a way of life that is structured on some level with respect to religious belief, but it's the structure rather than the belief that appeals to me. And so with that respect, I say, well, I regard myself as someone who was brought up in the sunnah of the Methodist Church. Even though the beliefs of Christianity have never appealed to me, I've never had a spiritual moment in my life. So the beliefs of Christianity don't interest me much. And the particular discipline of the Methodist Church that my family grew up in is loathsome. Essentially it's do not have fun in the following 10 ways. And so I reject the substance of it. I reject the belief side of it, but having structure that it gave to my life growing up. Now in old age, it strikes me, well, that structure was valuable, even though in some respects there were a lot of contradictions between what I was supposed to be, how I was supposed to be behaving, and how I wanted to behave. So I think that there are various things other than belief that have salience in terms of people saying who they are and what they are and where they came from. And the economy is one of them, but I don't think it's the only one.
Daniela?
לשים אצלי. Okay, just a minute. Okay, thanks very much for this thoughtful survey and for complicating things for us. Yet, still, I'd like to argue that like religious like Islam and Christianity have institutions, and there must be some difference between churchgoers and mosque goers, right? Both in their daily, even if supposedly they go once in a while to the church or to the mosque. So wouldn't you say that with time at least, the commitment to either religion deepens and the identities become more distinct from each other? This is one question. And the other question is, going back to the Philippines, I'm intrigued by the competition between Christianity and Islam because of my ignorance of the history of the Philippines. Can you say a little bit more about that? How did Christianity win Filipinos who were already Islamized, or at least nominally, or did it? Did most, as far as we know, are most Christian Filipinos, had they gone through a Muslim stage first, or the transition to either monotheistic or supposedly monotheistic religion come directly from the native religions, and Christianity was more successful Why? Do we have the perspective of the missionaries who engaged in this project?
On the Christian side, we certainly know something about the missionaries, the Jesuits, who were in particular. Interestingly, the Spanish Inquisition, which was Dominican, was established in the Philippines, but prohibited from dealing with the natives. The purpose of the Inquisition was to search out crypto-Jews and Christo-Muslims among the Spaniard community. And therefore, the authority of the Spanish Inquisition in the Philippines was always subordinate to the main Western Hemisphere center in Mexico City. And they found very few crypto-Jews and very few crypto-Muslims among the Spaniards. But in terms of dealing with the native population, it was the Jesuits who appeared to be the most important. In terms of the distinction between native Filipinos who were Muslims and native Filipinos who were pagans from a Christian terminological sense, the former were people against whom you warred. So the Moro wars were a very shaping structure, and the Spaniards really they carried over their attitude toward Muslims that they had from North Africa. And their idea was that the only good Moro is a dead Moro, or a Christian or a Christianized Moro. So one of the results of this is that there are virtually no surviving Qurans from the Philippines. The Southeast Asian librarian of the British Library has made a corpus of all the surviving Qurans, and has the number of surviving texts is under 40 for like 600 years of occupation. You have a similar paucity of texts from Indonesia. So the Christians wanted to spread Christianity to the pagans, but they were not trying to spread Christianity to the Muslims. They were trying to kill the Muslims. And therefore, we don't have any specific examples that I've run across of people who have been pagans, then became Muslims, and then became Christians. What the history of Christianity in the Philippines stresses is the relations between the Christians and the native religions, and then the relations with Islam that's the history of warfare. So it's hard to either get numbers or procedures coming from that. And your first question, you had another question before that.
Sorry. Yes, regarding the establishment of mosques and churches and the effect that they have.
Yeah, it was interesting in reading Dick Eaton's book about Bengal, about how you had this very dense Muslim population arising in East Bengal, but without any madrasas, without an ulama, without you had village shrines and village mosques, but you didn't have a more formal structure because you didn't have a hierarchy in a sense. That appears to be the case in the surviving areas of Islam in Mindanao. I look for mosques. Well, don't get much information on mosques. Sufi shrines, no. You look up shrines in Mindanao, they're all Christian shrines. The Christians did build buildings, Spanish style, these Spanish Baroque architecture, cathedrals, and so forth. And they made a big deal about the structures. But the Muslims do not appear to have to have created a series of edifices that would be foci of religious doctrine. I don't know of any elaborate Muslim tomb complexes or shrine complexes anywhere in the Philippines. Maybe just my lack of knowledge, because I haven't been engaged in this study for very long. But I don't think, I think it's going back to the work on Christianity in Sumatra. The folk level of Islam does not appear to involve institutions. It does appear to involve life processes, so that Islam in the Philippines or in Indonesia does appear to interrelate to childbirth, to weddings, to deaths, to ceremonies of all sorts, but not to formal religious structures centered on some sort of edifice and the administrative and spiritual staff that are associated with those edifices. And I was looking, obviously, for evidence of Sufi brotherhoods in the Philippines. And I found one textual reference to a Sufi brotherhood, but that did not appear to be terribly important. And when you get the stories, the early legend stories of missionaries who come to the Philippines, and there are a handful who are mentioned in texts. The form normally is they come to the Philippines and then they marry a princess, and then they produce offspring, so that it's the interaction with elites in these seaport cities that appears to be the structural forms for initially receiving Islam. But I don't think that there's much of any connection between that and the general spread of Islam in a sizable population such as the Maranao or the Tausug peoples down there in southern Philippines. So I things I expected to find simply weren't there. Sometimes you have to cope with what there is instead of what you want.
Interesting, thank you.
Yuval?
Yes, thank you, Professor Bulliet, for this very fascinating talk. I think that there is a useful question for all of us here about how conversion appears from the outside and from the inside, and the differences and the gaps in this regard. And I can tell you that I work on the Jesuits in China, which is, of course, a completely different story, but I think that I detect very similar patterns to what you described in the Philippines, in the sense that the missionaries regard conversion as something that is binary, but the converts themselves do not. And they can be at the same time Christian and Buddhist and Confucianist and so on, and it doesn't bother them. And in the Chinese example, I think that the missionaries they had various ways of dealing with this issue, but I think that a central solution was to regard the Christianity as the religious faith, and to regard all the other beliefs in a social or cultural way, meaning that the Jesuits explained that, of course, the Chinese, they converted to Christianity, and yes, they continue to worship Confucius, but this is just a social issue and cultural issue, and they pray to their fathers, but this is all a cultural thing. And they were severely criticized about it by other Europeans, of course, and in what is known as the Chinese lies controversy. And my question is, in the Philippine case, how did the missionaries reacted to the continuation of shaman traditions and to the variety of beliefs that their converts continued to possess? And what was the dialogue about this in the Philippines?
When I look into histories of Christianity in the Philippines, there appears to be an acceptance of the Filipino people continuing their practice, their shamanistic practices, as long as they proclaim themselves to be Christians. And with respect to the Jesuits, I'm reminded of the American Protestant missionaries who, one of the things they had to do was to come back to the United States from time to time to raise money. And they would come back and they would visit church congregations and talk about their successes and the experiences, so forth. And then they would pass the plate and they would collect money. And they would have publications. They regularly would write newsletters or reports for their sponsoring churches. And these often are extremely vivid and full of the difficulties of being missionaries and so forth. But there's always the question of, to what degree are these candid, or to what degree are these calculated in terms of the audience that will be reading the report. So the Jesuits are writing to, in a sense, to be read by other Christian luminaries back in Europe. But how they experienced things on the ground, I'm not sure you really know. One of the things that I had a student a number of years ago who found a trove of papers in the Yale Library of a missionary who spent, I think, 30 years in India and had extensive papers. Nobody had ever looked at them. And she wrote a superb undergraduate thesis on the life of this woman. But the one thing that she never talked about in her paper was the fact that at a certain point, when this woman had been in India for 20 years or so, a physician decided to become a missionary, and the two women lived together for the next 20 years, for the rest of their lives. And we talked about the question, well, in the 1920s, in what sort of profession could a highly educated woman function? Well, the missionary profession was really attractive because you could be a really important person out in the conversion field or in the missionary field, even though in the US you would have had a very limited number of jobs that you could hold. And particularly for lesbian women, that this was a teaching in a women's college or being a missionary in the field. This is a place where nobody was going to look into your personal lives because you were legitimized by your status as a professor at Bryn Mawr, say, or as a missionary in some place in India. So that whole aspect of the life of missionaries, who were among the Protestants predominantly women, is absent. Well, I sort of wonder, when you have these Jesuits who are off in different parts of the world, what is their life like when they are not praying? I mean, what has drawn them into this? I've known, as you may know, the New England province of the Jesuit order was responsible for missionary activities in Iraq. And I known a number of the fathers who worked in Iraq and then were thrown out during the political troubles in Iraq, and then centered in Lebanon. And I've wondered in some conversations about growing up as an Irishman in Boston and ending up in Iraq. What else could you have been in your life? And did being a Jesuit in the mission field change your life in a significant way? And I think that when we look at the intellectual products, they're usually silent about the personal lives. But to me, the personal lives are really important. And partly because, as I say, I wrote a memoir. And when I decided that the subtitle of the memoir would be My Life as an Orientalist, I argued, and partly this is because I shared faculty status at Columbia for 17 years with Edward Said, and we never had an extensive conversation. I was by far the most broadly published scholar on the Middle East and Columbia at that time, and we never talked. We lived in the same building. I mean, right now, as on the Zoom talk, the desk I'm sitting at is in what was Edward's study when he wrote Orientalism, because I now occupy the apartment that he and Miriam lived in during his time when he was writing mostly about the Middle East. So it's a little bit like in Arabic poetry, Kafa Nebki min Dhikra Habibin wa Manzili, where you come to the campsite of some previous people, but you have no actual relation to the people who were in the campsite before. You're their khulafa, but you are not them. And I'm in Edward's space. Edward was in this space before, but I'm not Edward. And so I got interested in, for the Orientalists, what do they do before in their lives, before that first class in Arabic? What is it that made them decide to devote their professional lives to studying a different part of the world with difficult languages? Why did they do this? And the implicit message of Edward's work is that they did it because imperial ambition made them do it. And I think that's bullshit. The empire does affect some people. And it may be that there are people who said, well, if I do this, I can become, a district supervisor of British administration in northern Kenya. But did anyone really ever think that? Or were there other patterns? What brings the person to the point of beginning to be an Orientalist, rather than what did they produce as Orientalists? And I think that's the part of the Saidian thought structure that has not been explored, and that he does not look into, just as he does not look into the question of why does he, as a Christian brought up in English and American educational systems, why does he decide to write about Islam? So I think that to confess, I don't read a lot of intellectual history because I find it very squishy. People assuming things about their audience, or assuming things about how they will appear when their thoughts are revealed. I deal at a much more simplistic level of history, of looking at how people live lives and why they end up in the life they're in. So I probably can't answer your question very directly.
Hey, I think unfortunately we're out of time. So I would like to thank you again very much, Professor Bulliet, for coming to speak with us or speaking with us from over there. Thank you very much. It was fascinating and lots of food for thought for the future.
Well, thank you very much for listening to me. This has been, in the last year, I've given about 3 lectures. I mean, I live a very isolated life. And so it's been fun to have a chance to talk about this stuff with interested people. So thank you very much for being an audience.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
They listen to you.